The phone lines at Luke Air Force Base began ringing at exactly 7:23 p.m. on March 13, 1997. Not one or two calls, but dozens, then hundreds, flooding the switchboard with such intensity that the operators had to disconnect non-emergency lines just to manage the chaos. The callers weren't reporting an attack or an accident. They were reporting something far stranger, something that would soon become the most witnessed UFO event in modern history. But this story doesn't begin with those phone calls. It begins 3 hours earlier, in the small mountain town of Paulden, Arizona, where John Kaiser was teaching his 14-year-old son how to use their new telescope. The desert sky had just begun its transformation from amber to deep purple, when John noticed something peculiar through his peripheral vision. 5 lights, arranged in a perfect 50 formation, moving silently across the sky from the northwest. At first he assumed it was a formation of military jets from the nearby base. But something was wrong. There was no sound, not even the distant rumble that follows jets at high altitude. The lights weren't blinking like aircraft navigation lights should. They were steady, warm, almost organic in their glow. John called his son over, and together they watched through the telescope as this massive formation passed directly overhead. What John saw through those lenses would haunt him for the rest of his life. The lights weren't attached to separate crafts. They were part of something singular, something massive, with a faint outline visible against the darkening sky that blocked out the stars behind it. The Kaiser family would later estimate the object to be at least a mile wide, moving at perhaps 30 miles per hour, completely silent, floating through the Arizona sky like a giant black triangle edged with amber lights. John's wife, Martha, came out when she heard their excited voices. She was a skeptic by nature, a nurse who dealt in facts and medical science, not fantasies. But when she saw what was moving across their property, she dropped the dish she was drying. It shattered on the concrete patio, but no one moved to clean it up. They stood there, all 3 of them, watching this impossible thing drift southward toward Phoenix. By 7:15, the formation had reached Prescott, a town of about 30,000 people, many of whom were outside enjoying the unusually warm March evening. Bill Greiner, a cement truck driver, was loading his truck for an early morning pour when he noticed his coworkers had stopped what they were doing and were staring at the sky. Bill would later describe what he saw as something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The craft, and he was certain it was a single craft, not multiple objects, was so large that it took nearly 2 full minutes to pass overhead. He could see its surface, which appeared to be a dark gray metal with a strange texture, almost like it was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The objects continued their steady path south, maintaining perfect formation, never wavering, never accelerating or slowing down. By 7:30 they had reached the northern edges of Phoenix, a sprawling metropolitan area home to over 3 million people. This is when the phones truly began to ring, not just at Luke Air Force Base but at police stations, news stations, and Sky Harbor International Airport. The reports were remarkably consistent. A massive V-shaped object with 5 to 7 lights, completely silent, moving slowly across the valley. Some witnesses described it as being so large that it looked like a floating city. Others said it was translucent, that they could see stars through it. But the most unsettling reports came from those who were directly underneath it when it passed. Tim Lay and his family were having a barbecue in their North Phoenix backyard when the craft passed directly over their home. Tim, a former Air Force communications specialist, knew aircraft. He knew their sounds, their lights, their behaviors. This was none of those things. As it passed overhead, so low that Tim felt he could almost touch it if he climbed onto his roof, he experienced something that military training hadn't prepared him for. A sensation of complete calm, almost hypnotic, as if the craft was somehow influencing his emotional state. His wife, Sarah, reported the same feeling, as did their teenage daughter. Even their usually hyperactive dog sat perfectly still, staring upward until the object had passed. The craft continued its journey across the valley, witnessed by thousands of people from all walks of life: doctors, lawyers, police officers, teachers, children, skeptics, and believers alike. It passed over downtown Phoenix, where hundreds of people in high-rise buildings had a lateral view of the object. Michael Fortson, a marketing executive working late in his 21st floor office, watched it approach from the north. He later stated that it was at least 2 city blocks wide, moving with a grace that defied physics. He grabbed his camera and managed to take several photographs before the object moved out of view. Those photographs would later disappear under mysterious circumstances, a detail that would become disturbingly common among witnesses. Dr. Lynn Kaiser, a well-respected Phoenix physician, had been documenting strange lights over the city for months before March 13th. But what she witnessed that night was different from anything she had seen before. From her mountainside home, she had a panoramic view of the valley. She watched as the V-shaped formation approached from the north. But she also noticed something else. Smaller orbs of light seemed to be detaching from the main craft, moving independently before rejoining the formation. She captured several minutes of video footage that would later become crucial evidence in understanding what really happened that night. As the craft moved over South Mountain, it performed something that challenged the remaining skeptics. It stopped. For nearly 5 minutes, this massive object hovered silently over the mountain, its lights pulsing in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. Hundreds of people pulled over on Interstate 10 to watch. Traffic backed up for miles. Chuck Reardon, a long-haul trucker from Texas, described it as the single most amazing and terrifying experience of his life. He said the object was so large that it created its own horizon, blocking out a significant portion of the sky. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, it began moving again, continuing south toward Tucson. But the night wasn't over. At approximately 8:30 p.m., a second event began. A series of lights appeared over the Estrella Mountains southwest of Phoenix. These lights were different from the V-shaped craft. They appeared to be individual orbs, hovering in a loose formation, visible for several minutes before disappearing one by one. The military would later claim these were flares dropped during a training exercise at the Barry Goldwater Range, but the witnesses who saw both events were adamant that these were 2 separate phenomena. The V-shaped craft was something solid, something massive, something that moved with purpose across 300 miles of Arizona. The lights over the Estrella Mountains were something else entirely. By 10 p.m., the phone lines were so jammed that emergency services were concerned about their ability to respond to actual emergencies. The Phoenix Police Department received over 2,000 calls. Sky Harbor International Airport, despite having the object pass through their airspace, officially reported that nothing unusual appeared on their radar. This contradiction would become one of the most contentious aspects of the incident. How could something so large, witnessed by so many, not appear on radar? Unless, of course, it did appear, and someone made the decision to deny it. Mike Fortson, the marketing executive who had photographed the object, arrived home to find something disturbing. His answering machine, which should have had messages from his wife and children who were out of town, instead had a single message. A voice, calm and professional, stating simply that his film would be collected and that it would be in his best interest to comply. 30 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits arrived at his door. They showed identification that Mike couldn't quite make out in the porch light, but their demeanor suggested authority. They asked for his camera and the film. Mike, confused and somewhat intimidated, complied. They thanked him and left. He never saw his photographs again. This scene would repeat itself across Phoenix that night and in the days that followed. Witnesses with video footage or photographs receiving visits, their evidence collected, sometimes with official-looking paperwork, sometimes with nothing more than a verbal request backed by an intimidating presence. The media, initially eager to cover the story, began to receive pressure to downplay the incident. The morning news broadcast that had led with the UFO sighting shifted to treating it as a curiosity, a fun story about mass hysteria rather than a serious investigation into what thousands of people had witnessed. Frances Emma Barwood, A Phoenix City councilwoman was one of the few officials who took the reports seriously. She began her own investigation, interviewing witnesses and collecting accounts. What she discovered was a pattern of intimidation and suppression. Witnesses were being told that what they saw was classified military aircraft, even though no military aircraft matched the descriptions. Others were simply told they were mistaken, that mass hysteria had caused them to misinterpret conventional aircraft or natural phenomena. But Barwood knew better. She had spoken to too many credible witnesses, seen too much consistency in their accounts. This was real, and someone was going to great lengths to cover it up. The official response came 5 days later. Governor Fife Symington held a press conference to address the growing concern and speculation. He said they were investigating the incident and taking it seriously. Then, in a moment that would anger witnesses for years to come, he brought out his chief of staff dressed in an alien costume, turning the entire incident into a joke. The message was clear. Anyone who claimed to have seen something extraordinary was to be laughed at, dismissed, marginalized. Years later, Symington would admit that he himself had seen the object and that the press conference was a mistake, an attempt to prevent panic that instead insulted thousands of witnesses. But the truth has a way of persisting. Despite the official denials, despite the ridicule, despite the collected evidence and intimidated witnesses, the story of the Phoenix Lights refused to die, because 10,000 people don't hallucinate the same thing. 10,000 people don't misidentify flares as a solid craft, the size of multiple football fields. 10,000 people don't independently describe the same impossible object, unless that object was real. And somewhere, in classified files and hidden archives, the truth about what flew over Arizona on March 13, 1997, waits to be revealed. The morning after the Phoenix Lights should have been chaos. It should have been the only story on every news channel, the only conversation in every coffee shop, the beginning of a new chapter in human understanding. Instead, something far stranger happened. The story began to disappear, not all at once, but slowly, methodically, like someone was carefully erasing it from public consciousness. Tom King, a veteran reporter for Phoenix's Channel 15, arrived at the station at 4 a.m. on March 14th to find his news director already there, along with 2 men he didn't recognize. They were reviewing his footage from the night before, footage that clearly showed the massive V-shaped object moving across the valley. The men asked Tom questions about his sources, about other footage he might have, about who else had copies. They were polite, but insistent. When Tom returned to his desk, the original tape was gone, replaced with a backup that contained only the later lights over the Estrella Mountains, the ones that could easily be explained as flares. This pattern repeated across the valley's media outlet. Reporters who had conducted extensive interviews found their tapes edited or missing. Witnesses who had agreed to go on camera suddenly became unreachable, their phones disconnected, their doors unanswered. Mary Cassette, who had been organizing a gathering of witnesses to compare their experiences, received a visit from someone claiming to be from the Federal Communications Commission. They informed her that organizing such a gathering without proper permits could result in significant fines. The permits they referenced didn't exist in any legal statute she could find, but the message was received. The gathering never happened. Dr. Lynn Kaiti continued her investigation despite the pressure. As a physician, she approached the phenomenon with scientific rigor, cataloging witness testimonies, analyzing video footage, creating timelines and maps. What she discovered was that the Phoenix Lights incident wasn't isolated. There had been similar sightings in the days leading up to March 13th and in the weeks that followed. Truck drivers on remote highways reported seeing massive triangular craft. Pilots flying into Phoenix reported objects that air traffic control insisted weren't there. Native Americans on reservations throughout Arizona spoke of lights and crafts that had been visiting their lands for generations. But March 13th was different. This time the visitors wanted to be seen. Richard Curtis, an amateur astronomer with 30 years of experience, had been photographing the night sky from his position on South Mountain when the craft passed overhead. His equipment was sophisticated, including cameras with various filters and spectrographic attachments. What his instruments recorded defied explanation. The lights on the craft weren't just lights. They were emitting energy in spectrums that shouldn't exist in conventional physics. The readings suggested manipulation of electromagnetic fields on a scale that human technology couldn't achieve. When Richard tried to share his findings with Arizona State University's physics department, he was told that his data must be corrupted, that equipment malfunction was the only explanation. But Richard knew his equipment. He had calibrated it himself that very afternoon. The readings were real. The military's explanation came exactly 1 week after the incident. Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones from Luke Air Force Base held a brief press conference, stating that the lights seen over the Estrella Mountains were flares dropped by AA-10 Warthog aircraft during a training exercise at the Barry Goldwater Range. He provided the exact time of the flare drop, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., and showed charts indicating the flight paths. But there was a problem with this explanation. The V-shaped craft had been witnessed as early as 7 p.m., well before any flares were dropped. When pressed about the earlier sightings, Jones simply stated that people must have been mistaken about the times. 10,000 people mistaken about when they looked at their watches. Bill Hamilton, a UFO researcher who had been investigating sightings in Arizona for 20 years, knew something significant had happened when his government sources suddenly went silent. People who had previously provided him with information about classified projects stopped returning his calls. One contact, a retired Air Force intelligence officer, met him briefly in a park to deliver a warning. He told Bill that this incident was different, that it involved technology and implications that went beyond typical UFO encounters. He suggested that Bill stop his investigation for his own safety. When Bill asked what made this incident so special, the officer simply said that the craft wasn't visiting, it was demonstrating. The witnesses themselves began to experience strange aftereffects. Susan Kensington, a kindergarten teacher who had watched the craft pass over her Scottsdale home, began having vivid dreams about symbols and mathematical equations she didn't understand. She started writing them down, filling notebooks with complex diagrams that looked like technical schematics. When she showed them to her brother, an electrical engineer, he was stunned. Some of the diagrams depicted theoretical propulsion systems that were being researched at the highest levels of aerospace companies. Susan had no background in physics or engineering. She taught 5-year-olds how to tie their shoes. Marcus Williams, a Phoenix police officer who had witnessed the craft while on patrol, began experiencing missing time. He would leave for work at his usual time, but arrive an hour late with no memory of the delay. His dashboard camera, which should have recorded continuously, showed gaps in the footage. During one of these gaps, his patrol car's odometer added 40 miles. But GPS tracking showed the vehicle never moved from a parking lot on the city's north side. Marcus requested a leave of absence after 3 weeks of these incidents. He never returned to active duty. The economic impact of the incident was carefully hidden but substantial. Sky Harbor International Airport reported no disruptions to air traffic on March 13, but investigation revealed that dozens of flights had been delayed or rerouted. Pilots, speaking on condition of anonymity, described being ordered to circle or change course with no explanation. One American Airlines pilot with 25 years of experience said he watched the object pass directly beneath his aircraft at 25,000 feet. It was so large that it filled his entire field of view. When he reported it to air traffic control, he was told to maintain radio silence and continue his approach. The official logs from that night show no such communication. Dr. Brad Evans, a psychologist who specialized in mass hysteria and group dynamics, was brought in by city officials to explain the sightings as a form of collective delusion. After interviewing 50 witnesses, he reversed his position entirely. These weren't people prone to fantasy or suggestion. They were lawyers, doctors, police officers, military personnel. Their accounts were consistent, not because they had influenced each other, but because they had all seen the same thing. Dr. Evans' report was never made public. He was paid his consulting fee and thanked for his time. When he tried to publish his findings independently, he found that no academic journal would accept his paper. The Phoenix Lights incident attracted the attention of serious researchers from around the world. Dr. Jacques Vallée, the renowned computer scientist and UFO researcher, arrived in Phoenix 2 weeks after the incident. His investigation focused not on what the object was, but on the pattern of its appearance. The craft had followed a specific path, appearing over populated areas while avoiding restricted military airspace. It had moved slowly enough to be seen clearly but fast enough to cross the entire state in one evening. The lights had been bright enough to attract attention but not so bright as to cause panic. To Valet, this suggested intelligence and purpose. The craft wanted to be seen but within controlled parameters. Tier Davenport, director of the National UFO Reporting Center, received over 700 reports about the Phoenix lights in the first week alone. What struck him was not just the number of reports, but their quality. These were detailed, coherent accounts from credible witnesses. Many included specific times, directions, and measurements. Some witnesses had used landmarks to estimate the craft's size. Others had noted its speed by timing its movement between fixed points. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was mass observation of something extraordinary. As weeks turned to months, a disturbing pattern emerged among witnesses. Many reported being contacted by someone claiming to be conducting a follow-up investigation. These investigators had credentials that seemed legitimate, but the agencies they claimed to represent had no record of them. They asked detailed questions about what witnesses had seen, but more importantly, they asked who else the witnesses had told. They collected photographs, videos, and written accounts, always promising that the evidence would be analyzed and returned. Nothing was ever returned. James Delatoso, a computer analyst who specialized in video authentication, managed to obtain copies of several videos before they were confiscated. His analysis revealed something remarkable. The lights on the craft weren't just illumination. They were creating some kind of field effect, distorting the air around them in ways that suggested massive electromagnetic or gravitational forces. The videos also showed something else, something that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. There appeared to be a structure connecting the lights, a faint outline of something massive and solid. When Delatoso tried to present his findings at a scientific conference, his invitation was suddenly revoked. The summer of 1997 brought an oppressive heat to Phoenix, but it also brought something else, a wave of fear that had nothing to do with temperature. Witnesses to the March 13th incident began experiencing visits that went beyond simple intimidation. Jennifer Markham, a real estate agent who had filmed the craft from her Paradise Valley home, woke one night in July to find her bedroom filled with a low humming sound. Her digital clock read 2:33 a.m., but when she looked at her analog watch, it showed 4:45. The humming grew louder, and then her entire house lost power. In the darkness, she saw a pale blue light filtering through her windows, moving across the walls like liquid. She tried to get up, but found herself unable to move, not paralyzed but held in place by something she couldn't see or understand. The experience lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it ended, when she could finally move, she discovered that every electronic device in her home had been reset. Computers, televisions, microwave ovens, all showing default settings, as if they had just been unboxed. But strangest of all was her video camera. The tape that had contained her footage of the Phoenix lights was still there, but it was blank, not erased in the conventional sense, but blank, as if it had never been used. This phenomenon, which witnesses quietly began calling the visits, happened to at least 40 people who had prominently discussed their sightings, always between 2 and 5 a.m., always accompanied by the humming sound and blue light, always resulting in electronic interference. Dr. Lynn Kaite documented 17 cases, finding disturbing similarities. Many witnesses reported feeling a presence in the room, though they saw no one. Some described receiving information, not through words but through direct thought, complex concepts about physics and consciousness that they couldn't fully understand or articulate. Others experienced what they could only describe as a download, suddenly knowing things they hadn't known before, but unable to explain how or why. The military response to these incidents was swift and strange. Residents near Luke Air Force Base reported increased activity, Not just flights but ground vehicles moving in convoy formations at night, heading into the desert and returning before dawn. Sarah Mitchell, whose property bordered the base, used night vision equipment to observe these convoys. The vehicles weren't standard military trucks. They were unmarked, with unusual antenna arrays, and what appeared to be sensor equipment. On 3 occasions, she saw them stop at specific coordinates in the desert, deploy equipment, and remain stationary for hours. When she later visited these locations during daylight, she found unusual ground markings, circular patterns in the sand that looked almost like something had landed. Meanwhile, the official narrative continued to evolve. The military now claimed that there had been 2 separate events on March 13th. The V-shaped craft that thousands had seen was dismissed as a formation of planes flying in from Nellis Air Force Base. The lights over the Estrella Mountains were maintained to be flared, but when pressed for flight logs, radar data, or any documentation supporting these claims, officials cited national security. The very evidence that could prove their explanation was classified. This circular logic frustrated investigators, but effectively ended any official inquiry. Kurt Russell, the actor, would later reveal that he had been flying his son into Phoenix on March 13th, and had seen the lights. As a licensed pilot, he had reported them to the control tower. Years later, when he tried to obtain the records of his report, he was told no such report existed. The flight logs showed he had landed without incident, with no unusual communications recorded. This pattern of disappearing evidence extended beyond official channels. Local libraries found that newspaper archives from March 14th had been checked out and never returned. Microfilm copies were discovered to be damaged. The specific frames containing Phoenix Lights coverage mysteriously corrupted. Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who had spent years studying individuals who claimed alien contact, arrived in Phoenix in August. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, finding something he hadn't expected. Unlike typical UFO witnesses who often showed signs of trauma or confusion, the Phoenix Lights witnesses exhibited what he called resonance. They seemed changed and subtle, but consistent ways. Many reported increased intuition, sudden interest in quantum physics or consciousness studies, and most remarkably a shared sense that the event had been a message, though none could articulate what that message was. The Native American perspective on the incident provided another layer of complexity. Robert Morning Sky, a Hopi elder, revealed that tribal traditions spoke of similar events throughout history. The Phoenix Lights, he claimed, matched descriptions of the star people recorded in petroglyphs and oral histories. But this wasn't just another sighting. The elders believed it was a warning, a sign that humanity was approaching a crucial junction. The craft's path had followed ancient ley lines, energy pathways recognized by indigenous peoples but dismissed by modern science. In September, an anonymous package arrived at the office of Phoenix New Times, an alternative weekly newspaper. It contained military documents that appeared to be genuine, complete with classification stamps and proper formatting. The documents described Operation Snowbird, a joint military-civilian program designed to test psychological responses to UFO sightings. According to these papers, the Phoenix Lights had been a test of advanced holographic technology, projecting 3-dimensional images into the sky to gauge public reaction. The newspaper began investigating, but within days, their offices were raided by federal agents claiming to be investigating an unrelated matter. The documents were confiscated as evidence and never returned. William Hamilton received a different kind of anonymous package. It contained photographs taken from what appeared to be a military surveillance aircraft. The images showed the V-shaped craft from above, revealing details not visible from the ground. The craft's surface was covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift between frames, as if the hull itself was active somehow. Most remarkably, one photograph showed what appeared to be smaller craft deployed from the main vessel, orbs of light that maintained perfect formation around the larger ship. The metadata on the photographs had been scrubbed, but analysis of the images suggested they were taken at approximately 30,000 feet. Hamilton tried to verify their authenticity, but every expert he consulted was either unable or unwilling to examine them. This psychological impact on the community was profound, but rarely discussed openly. Support groups formed quietly, meeting in private homes rather than public spaces. These weren't gatherings of UFO enthusiasts but of ordinary people, trying to process an extraordinary experience. Mary Chen, a therapist who facilitated one of these groups, noted that participants weren't seeking validation. They knew what they had seen. They were seeking understanding, trying to integrate an experience that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. Many reported that the sighting had triggered spiritual crises, or awakenings, forcing them to reconsider their place in the universe. By October, a new phenomenon emerged. Witnesses began reporting shared dreams, vivid experiences where they found themselves aboard the craft they had seen months earlier. The interior descriptions were remarkably consistent, featuring curved walls that emitted soft light, symbols that seemed to move and change, and beings that communicated without speaking. These weren't the typical gray aliens of popular culture, but something else, taller, more ethereal, seeming to exist partially in this dimension and partially elsewhere. The dreams always ended the same way, with a return to the desert and a sense of having forgotten something important. Dr. Roger Luhr, a surgeon who had gained notoriety for removing alleged alien implants, came to Phoenix after being contacted by several witnesses who claimed to have discovered unusual objects in their bodies after the sighting. Using sophisticated medical imaging, he found anomalies in 7 individuals, small metallic objects that didn't show up properly on X-rays, but were visible on MRI scans. When he attempted to remove one surgically, he found that it was connected to nerve endings in ways that suggested it had grown into place rather than being inserted. The object, when finally extracted, was submitted for analysis. The preliminary results showed isotopic ratios, not found in terrestrial materials. Before the full analysis could be completed, the sample was confiscated by authorities claiming it posed a potential health risk. The economic implications of the incident continued to ripple through the community. Tourism to Phoenix increased by 30% in the 6 months following the sighting, with UFO tours becoming a cottage industry. But local businesses that catered to these tourists often faced unexpected difficulties. Permits were denied, licenses revoked on technicalities, tax audits initiated with unusual frequency. The message was subtle but clear. Profiting from the Phoenix Lights was discouraged. Yet the tours continued, operating in legal gray areas, because public interest remained intense. By November of 1997, the Phoenix Lights had become something more than a mass sighting. They had become a cultural phenomenon that refused to fade. But behind the public fascination, a more sinister pattern was emerging. David Carlson, a computer programmer who had created one of the first websites documenting witness testimonies, noticed something troubling. His site was experiencing targeted attacks, not the random harassment common to the early internet, but sophisticated intrusions that suggested professional involvement. Someone was systematically downloading witness information, IP addresses, email contacts, and then those witnesses would go silent. When David tried to warn people through his site, he found his internet service terminated without explanation. The provider claimed technical violations that didn't exist in their terms of service. When he switched providers, the same thing happened again. The investigation took a darker turn when Michael Tanner, a former military intelligence analyst, decided to use his connections to dig deeper into the official response. What he found disturbed him enough that he initially refused to share it with anyone. The morning after the Phoenix Lights, a special operations team had been deployed from Fort Huachuca, not to investigate the sighting, but to implement something called Protocol 7. Michael had never heard of Protocol 7, and when he tried to access information about it through classified databases he still had limited access to, he triggered security alerts. Within hours his security clearance was revoked, his pension was threatened, and he received a visit from men who didn't identify themselves but made it clear that his investigation was over. Before going completely silent, Michael managed to send one message to a trusted colleague. Protocol 7 was a containment strategy, designed not for biological or chemical threats, but for something categorized as anomalous technological exposure. The witnesses themselves were beginning to notice patterns that went beyond individual experiences. Through careful private communication, they discovered that many of them had been experiencing synchronized phenomena every night at exactly 11:11 p.m. Those who had been directly under the craft would experience a sensation they described as tuning in, as if their consciousness was briefly connecting to something vast and incomprehensible. During these moments, some reported seeing geometric patterns, complex mathematical structures that seemed to convey meaning without words. Dr. Kaiser documented these experiences, finding that the patterns people described were remarkably similar to sacred geometry found in ancient cultures worldwide, structures that modern mathematicians recognized as representations of higher dimensional space. The children who had witnessed the Phoenix Lights presented a particularly interesting subset of experiences. Unlike adults, who often struggled to articulate what they had seen and felt, children expressed themselves through drawings and play. Child psychologist Dr. Patricia Holbrook collected over 200 drawings from young witnesses. The consistency was remarkable. They drew not just the V-shaped craft but details that hadn't been widely reported. Interior spaces, beings of light, and most remarkably star maps showing constellation patterns that didn't match Earth's sky. When an astronomer analyzed these drawings, he found that the star patterns were accurate, but from a perspective approximately 39 light-years from Earth, in the direction of the Zeta Reticuli system. In December, something happened that would have been headline news if anyone had been willing to report it. A group of Phoenix Lights witnesses, approximately 30 individuals who had maintained contact despite warnings, decided to return to South Mountain on the 9-month anniversary of the sighting. They gathered at the same location where many had watched the craft pass overhead, hoping to find some sense of closure or understanding. At exactly 9 p.m., the time when the craft had hovered over the mountain, they experienced what could only be described as a collective vision. Each person simultaneously but independently saw the same scene. They were standing in a vast space, architecture that seemed both ancient and impossibly advanced, facing beings that radiated a sense of profound sadness. The message, conveyed without words, was clear. Humanity was being evaluated, and the outcome was uncertain. The vision lasted only moments, but when it ended, several witnesses found they had tears streaming down their faces, though they felt no sadness themselves. James Thompson, a former NASA engineer who had moved to Phoenix after retirement, brought a different perspective to the investigation. Using his knowledge of spacecraft design and propulsion systems, he analyzed witness descriptions and the few remaining video recording. His conclusion was professionally devastating, but personally liberating. The craft demonstrated technologies that weren't just advanced versions of human engineering, but operated on entirely different principles. The propulsion system appeared to manipulate space-time itself, creating a bubble of altered physics around the craft. This would explain the silence, the impossible maneuvers, and the electromagnetic effect, but it also implied a level of scientific understanding that humanity was centuries, perhaps millennia, from achieving. James tried to publish his analysis through scientific journals, but every submission was rejected without peer review, often with the explanation that the journal didn't publish speculative fiction. The corporate response to the Phoenix Lights was equally telling. Several aerospace companies based in Arizona suddenly implemented new security protocols that seemed excessive for their stated operations. Employees were required to sign updated non-disclosure agreements that specifically mentioned anomalous aerial phenomena. Research projects were compartmentalized beyond standard practice. Most significantly, several companies began recruiting experts in fields that seemed unrelated to conventional aerospace: quantum consciousness researchers, specialists in nonlinear time, and theorists working on the relationship between electromagnetic fields and biological systems. When questioned about these hiring practices, company representatives provided vague statements about exploring future technologies. Local hospitals began noticing unusual patterns in their emergency rooms. In the weeks following the Phoenix Lights, there was a significant increase in patients reporting symptoms that didn't match any known conditions. Sudden onset of electromagnetic sensitivity, where patients couldn't tolerate being near electronic devices; temporary telepathic experiences, where individuals claimed to hear the thoughts of others. Most remarkably, several patients exhibited physiological changes that couldn't be explained: altered brainwave patterns, unusual electromagnetic fields emanating from their bodies, and in 3 documented cases, DNA anomalies that suggested recent mutation. These cases were quickly transferred to military medical facilities, and the records were sealed. Dr. Stephen Greer, who had been conducting civilian UFO research for years, arrived in Phoenix with a team of investigators. What they discovered through interviews and field research convinced them that the Phoenix Lights were part of a larger pattern of contact that had been accelerating since the end of the Cold War. The craft hadn't just appeared randomly. Its flight path had followed a specific trajectory that passed over key installations, including nuclear facilities, military bases, and interestingly several locations of archaeological significance to Native American tribes. Greer's team also discovered residual electromagnetic anomalies at locations where the craft had reportedly hovered, signatures that suggested the manipulation of forces beyond conventional physics. The international response to the Phoenix Lights was carefully managed, but revealing. Intelligence services from several nations sent representatives to Arizona under various covers. The British, Russians, and Chinese were particularly interested, not just in the sighting itself but in the American response to it. Classified communications later leaked, revealed that these nations believed the United States had either made contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence or had developed technology that could simulate such contact. The possibility that America possessed either alien technology or the ability to fake it was equally concerning to global powers. By the end of 1997, the Phoenix Lights had evolved from a local incident to a global mystery. But in Phoenix itself, something fundamental had changed. The city that had witnessed the impossible could never quite return to normal. Property values in areas with clear views of the flight path increased mysteriously. Observatory equipment sales skyrocketed, and every clear night, hundreds of people would gather in the desert, watching, waiting, hoping for a return that some felt was inevitable. The craft had delivered its message, whatever that message was, and now humanity had to decide what to do with it. The year 1998 began with an event that should have vindicated every witness to the Phoenix Lights, but instead deepened the mystery. On January 15th, a convoy of unmarked trucks was spotted entering the Barry Goldwater Range at 3 a.m. Rebecca Martinez, a park ranger who lived near the range's eastern boundary, was awakened by the sound of heavy vehicles and helicopters. Through her binoculars, she watched as the convoy stopped at a specific location and began what appeared to be an excavation. Earth-moving equipment worked through the night, and by dawn they had created a hole approximately 50 feet wide. Then something was brought in, covered by a massive tarp, and lowered into the excavation. The hole was filled. The ground was restored to its original appearance, and the convoy departed. When Rebecca tried to report what she had seen through official channels, she was told she had witnessed a routine military exercise. When she persisted, she was transferred to a station 200 miles away. The transfer of witnesses became a pattern throughout early 1998. People who had been vocal about their experiences found themselves suddenly relocated for work, their companies citing unexpected reorganization. Others discovered that their mortgage applications were denied, their children weren't accepted to local schools, or their professional licenses were under review for vague irregularities. It wasn't persecution in any legally definable sense, but it was effective. By March, many of the most credible witnesses had left Phoenix, scattered across the country, their collective voice diluted by distance. But technology was making it harder to suppress information. The internet, still in its relative infancy, became a gathering place for witnesses and researchers. Email lists connected people who had been isolated, and websites archived testimonies that might otherwise have been lost. It was through these digital networks that patterns began to emerge that no single investigator could have discovered. Witnesses in Phoenix were connecting with people who had experienced similar sightings in other locations, at other times, and they were finding remarkable consistency. The V-shaped craft, or something very similar, had been seen over Belgium in 1990, over Illinois in 2000, and would later appear over Texas in 2008. Each time, the pattern was the same: mass witnesses, official denial, evidence suppression, and the gradual dissolution of public interest. Dr. Lin Kai-Tay made a discovery that challenged the conventional timeline of the Phoenix Lights. While reviewing archived footage from local television stations, she found evidence of similar lights appearing over Phoenix, dating back to 1995. The sightings had been smaller, less dramatic, witnessed by fewer people, but the lights themselves were identical to those seen on March 13. This suggested that whatever had happened wasn't a single event, but part of an extended observation or operation. When she tried to investigate further, she found that footage from those earlier dates had been systematically removed from television archives, leaving only written logs that mentioned unusual lights, without providing details. The psychological impact on witnesses continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, who had been studying the children who witnessed the event, noticed that many of them were displaying unusual cognitive abilities: enhanced pattern recognition, intuitive understanding of complex mathematical concepts, and in several cases what could only be described as precognitive experience. These children would draw pictures of events days before they happened. Nothing dramatic, just everyday occurrences, but with details that couldn't be explained by coincidence. When standardized testing was conducted, these children scored significantly higher than their previous assessments, not through learned knowledge, but through what appeared to be enhanced cognitive processing. A former Air Force pilot named Robert Collins came forward with information that added another dimension to the mystery. He claimed that on the night of March 13, he had been scrambled from Luke Air Force Base along with 3 other pilots to intercept the unknown craft. They had made visual contact at 20,000 feet and attempted to communicate using standard protocols. The craft had responded, not through radio, but by projecting symbols directly onto their heads-up displays. Symbols that resembled hieroglyphics, but with a mathematical precision that suggested they were more than mere writing. The pilots were ordered to return to base immediately, debriefed for 6 hours, and made to sign security oaths that went beyond standard military classification. Collins had kept silent for a year, but the weight of what he had experienced compelled him to speak, though he knew it would likely end his career and possibly result in prosecution. The response to Collins' revelation was swift and predictable. Within days, his military records were called into question. Officials claimed he had never been stationed at Luke Air Force Base on the date in question, that his flight log showed no activity that night. But other pilots, speaking anonymously, confirmed elements of his story. They described similar scrambles over the years, intercepts of objects that defied explanation, and always the same response: immediate recall, intensive debriefing, and absolute silence. The Phoenix Lights, they suggested, weren't unique. They were simply the instance where containment had failed, where too many civilians had seen too much to completely suppress. In May of 1998, a conference was held in Scottsdale, bringing together witnesses, researchers and scientists willing to risk their reputations to discuss the Phoenix Lights. The conference was supposed to be private, invitation only, but it was infiltrated by individuals who seemed more interested in identifying attendees than participating in discussions. Several speakers reported that their hotel rooms were searched while they attended sessions. Computer files were accessed, though nothing was apparently taken. The message was clear: you are being watched, and we want you to know it. Despite the intimidation, the conference produced several significant developments. A physicist from Caltech, speaking on condition of anonymity, presented an analysis suggesting that the electromagnetic signatures reported around the craft were consistent with the manipulation of zero-point energy fields, a theoretical power source that could provide virtually unlimited energy by tapping into quantum fluctuations in empty space. An aerospace engineer demonstrated how the movement patterns of the craft suggested it was using some form of inertial dampening, allowing it to accelerate instantly without crushing any occupants. And a psychologist presented evidence that witnesses were experiencing what he called consciousness expansion, a permanent alteration in their perception and cognitive abilities. The summer brought a new wave of sightings. Smaller but significant lights appeared over Phoenix on June 13th, July 13th, and August 13th, always at the same time, always in similar formations. It was as if something was maintaining a schedule, checking in on the city that had witnessed the grand display. These follow-up sightings were barely reported in mainstream media, but witnesses gathered to observe them, creating an informal network of skygazers who documented everything. They noticed that the lights appeared to respond to observation, growing brighter when photographed, moving when groups gathered to watch them. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a cleaning woman who worked at a defense contractor's facility, discovered documents that had been improperly disposed of. They referenced Project Starlight, a classified program that had been monitoring unconventional aerial phenomena since 1947. According to these documents, the Phoenix lights represented something called a demonstration phase, though what was being demonstrated and to whom remained unclear. The documents also mentioned biological effects on witnesses, changes that were being monitored through medical databases, and insurance records. Maria passed the documents to a journalist before disappearing. Her family received a letter saying she had taken a job overseas, but the letter was typed, and Maria didn't know how to type. The fall of 1998 brought with it an unexpected development that would forever change the understanding of the Phoenix Lights incident. Dr. Jonathan Reed, a microbiologist working at Arizona State University, made a discovery while analyzing soil samples from South Mountain. The samples collected from areas where witnesses reported the craft had hovered contained microscopic spheres of an unknown metallic compound. These spheres were perfectly uniform, measuring exactly 100 nanometers in diameter, and exhibited properties that shouldn't exist in nature. They were magnetic at room temperature, but became superconducting when cooled by just a few degrees. More remarkably, they seemed to be exchanging information with each other through quantum entanglement, maintaining instantaneous correlation regardless of distance. When Reed tried to publish his findings, his laboratory was shut down for contamination that inspectors couldn't actually identify. His samples were confiscated, his research grants were terminated, and he was offered a generous early retirement package with the stipulation that he never discuss his work publicly. But Reed wasn't the only scientist making unusual discoveries. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist at the Barrow Neurological Institute, had been secretly studying witnesses who reported the consciousness expansion effects. Using advanced brain imaging technology, she found that these individuals showed increased activity in areas of the brain typically dormant in most humans. The pineal gland, often called the third eye in spiritual traditions, was significantly enlarged in many witnesses. More intriguingly, their brains were producing a novel neurotransmitter that resembled DMT, the compound associated with intense spiritual experiences, but with a molecular structure that included elements not typically found in biological systems. When Chen attempted to synthesize this compound, she discovered it could facilitate what appeared to be telepathic communication between test subjects. Her research was immediately classified, and she was relocated to a military medical facility where her work could be contained. The witnesses themselves were undergoing transformations that went beyond the physiological. Mark Stevens, an accountant who had observed the craft from his downtown Phoenix office, began experiencing what he called downloads of information. Complex mathematical equations would appear in his mind fully formed, describing principles of physics he had never studied. He started filling notebooks with these equations, eventually accumulating thousands of pages. When a physicist friend examined them, he recognized elements of unified field theory, solutions to problems that had puzzled scientists for decades. But the mathematics went beyond current human understanding, incorporating dimensions and variables that suggested a completely different framework for understanding reality. In October, an event occurred that the media couldn't ignore, though they certainly tried. During a Phoenix Suns basketball game at America West Arena, witnessed by over 18,000 people, a formation of lights identical to those seen on March 13 appeared directly over the stadium. The lights hovered for exactly 13 minutes, creating panic in the crowd. The game was suspended, and people fled to the parking lots. This time,
Hundreds of cameras captured the event from multiple angles. The local news had no choice but to report it, though they were quick to accept the official explanation that it was a promotional stunt involving holographic projections. No company ever claimed responsibility for this supposed promotion, and experts who analyzed the footage couldn't identify any projection equipment that could create such an effect. The government response to this public sighting was different from their handling of the original incident. Instead of denial, they offered a partial admission.
The Native American perspective continued to provide unique insights. A gathering of tribal elders from across the Southwest convened in secret to discuss the Phoenix Lights in the context of their oral traditions. According to Thomas B. Nyasia, a Hopi elder, the sightings fulfilled specific prophecies about the end of the Fourth World and the beginning of the Fifth. The craft's flight path had followed sacred routes, known only to initiated members of certain clans, routes that connected power points in the landscape that had been recognized for thousands of years. The elders believed that humanity was being given a final opportunity to change course before irreversible consequences manifested. In November, a leak from within the Defense Intelligence Agency revealed the existence of Project Aquarius, a deep black program that had been monitoring and analyzing UFO encounters since the 1950s. According to the leaked documents, the Phoenix Lights incident had been anticipated and allowed to occur as part of a gradual disclosure process. The documents suggested that full revelation of the extraterrestrial or interdimensional presence would cause societal collapse, so a controlled release of information was being orchestrated. The Phoenix Lights were described as a test of public reaction, and the results had led to significant debate within the program about how to proceed. Dr. Jacques Vallée returned to Phoenix with a new hypothesis. Based on his analysis of witness testimonies and the pattern of sightings worldwide, he proposed that the phenomenon represented a control system, a mechanism by which human consciousness and culture were being influenced toward specific ends. The craft themselves might be real, but their appearance was staged, designed to create specific psychological and social effects. The Phoenix Lights in this interpretation were a calibration point, a massive injection of anomalous experience into the collective consciousness to measure and direct humanity's response to the unknown. As 1998 drew to a close, a support group for Phoenix Lights witnesses had grown to over 500 members. They met monthly in different locations to avoid surveillance, sharing their experiences and the ongoing changes in their lives. Many reported that their entire worldview had shifted. Religious beliefs had been challenged or transformed. Career paths had changed, as witnesses felt compelled to pursue work with greater meaning. Relationships had been strained as some struggled to integrate their experience, while others couldn't accept what their partners had witnessed. But almost universally, witnesses reported that despite the difficulties, they wouldn't change what had happened. They had been given a glimpse behind the veil of reality, and that knowledge, however burdensome, was precious. The year ended with a curious phenomenon. On December 31st, as Phoenix prepared to celebrate the new year, witnesses reported a shared experience. At exactly 11:59 p.m., they felt a collective pulse, a momentary connection to something vast and benevolent. For just an instant, they sensed millions, perhaps billions of other consciousnesses, not all human, linked in a network of awareness that spanned impossible distances. Then it was gone, leaving only the memory and the absolute certainty that humanity was not alone, had never been alone, and was approaching a moment of critical importance in its evolution. January 1999 arrived with an ominous development. Frank Morrison, a computer systems analyst who had been documenting witness testimonies, discovered something disturbing in his data. Cross-referencing medical records that witnesses had voluntarily shared, he found that 17 people who had been directly under the craft were developing the same rare form of brain tumor. Not cancer exactly, but a growth that appeared to be integrating with neural tissue rather than destroying it. Medical scans showed these growths were geometrically perfect, forming crystalline structures that shouldn't be possible in biological tissue. Even more remarkably, the affected individuals weren't experiencing negative symptoms. Instead, they reported enhanced cognitive abilities, perfect memory recall, and the ability to perceive electromagnetic fields with their naked eyes. When Morrison tried to alert health authorities,
He found that these cases had already been flagged and transferred to a special medical task force that officially didn't exist. The Vatican's involvement in the Phoenix Lights investigation had been rumored for months, but in February, evidence surfaced that confirmed it. Sister Mary Catherine, a Dominican nun who worked as a translator at the Vatican Observatory in Arizona, revealed that church officials had been conducting their own investigation since the night of the sighting. The Vatican's Advanced Telescope facility on Mount Graham had captured extraordinary footage of the craft, including spectrographic analysis that showed it was emitting light in patterns that matched ancient religious texts' descriptions of angelic manifestations. The Church was grappling with theological implications that threatened 2,000 years of doctrine. If these were extraterrestrial beings, did they have souls? Had Christ's sacrifice been for them as well, or were they something else entirely? Perhaps the angels and demons of Scripture manifesting in a technological age. The corporate response to the Phoenix Lights evolved in unexpected ways. Several major technology companies quietly established research facilities in the Phoenix area, officially focused on conventional projects, but actually investigating applications of the anomalous physics suggested by the craft's behavior. Intel developed a quantum computing project that seemed to incorporate principles no one could explain. Motorola's semiconductor division began experimenting with materials that exhibited properties similar to those Dr. Reed had discovered in the soil samples.
Most significantly, a consortium of aerospace companies jointly funded a research facility in the Sonoran Desert, so classified that even its existence was denied. Employees were transported in windowless vehicles, worked in underground facilities, and lived on-site for months at a time. In March, on the second anniversary of the Phoenix Lights, something extraordinary happened. Over 300 witnesses gathered in secret at South Mountain despite attempts by authorities to prevent the meeting. At exactly 9 p.m., the time when the craft had hovered 2 years earlier, the gathered witnesses experienced a collective vision more intense than anything previously reported. They found themselves seemingly transported aboard the craft, standing in a vast chamber filled with holographic star maps. Beings of indescribable beauty and terror communicated directly with their consciousness, showing them images of Earth's potential futures. Some futures showed paradise, with humanity having evolved beyond physical form, exploring dimensions beyond space and time. Others showed devastation, the planet rendered lifeless by war, environmental collapse, or something worse. The message was clear that humanity stood at a crossroads, and the choices made in the coming years would determine which future would manifest. When the vision ended, witnesses found that exactly 1 hour had passed, though the experience had seemed to last only minutes. More mysteriously, everyone present had a small mark on their right hand, a perfect triangle with a circle at each point, that faded within hours but left a faint luminescence visible only under ultraviolet light. Medical examination revealed that the marked tissue had been altered at the cellular level, DNA modified in ways that suggested deliberate bioengineering. Those marked reported permanent changes in their perception, the ability to sense others who had been marked, and occasional flashes of knowledge that seemed to come from outside their own minds. Dr. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist from Laurentian University, arrived in Phoenix with a controversial theory. He proposed that the Phoenix Lights and their associated effects were the result of interaction between natural electromagnetic phenomena and human consciousness. The craft itself might be a projection, a three-dimensional hologram created by the collective unconscious of humanity responding to geomagnetic stimulation. His experiments with electromagnetic fields applied to the temporal lobes had produced similar visions and experiences in laboratory subjects. But when he attempted to recreate the Phoenix Lights effects, something unexpected happened. The electromagnetic fields he generated seemed to attract something, creating anomalies in his equipment and causing all electronic devices within a mile radius to malfunction simultaneously. The children who had witnessed the Phoenix Lights continued to develop in unusual ways. By 1999, many were demonstrating abilities that defied conventional understanding. Sarah Thompson, who had been 7 when she saw the craft, could now accurately predict earthquakes, days before they occurred. Timothy Martinez, 12 at the time of the sighting, had developed a form of mathematics that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental variable,
producing equations that MIT professors couldn't fully understand but recognized as potentially revolutionary. Most remarkably, these children seemed to be connected, sharing dreams, completing each other's sentences, and occasionally acting in perfect synchronization despite being separated by great distances. A whistleblower from within the National Security Agency revealed that intelligence agencies had been monitoring Phoenix Lights witnesses through a program called Stargate Redux. Every phone call, email, and internet search was being analyzed for patterns. The program had identified what analysts called the Phoenix Network, a growing group of individuals who seemed to be receiving and transmitting information through unconventional means. Some witnesses appeared to be unconsciously encoding messages in their everyday communications, hidden patterns that only emerged when analyzed with specific algorithms. The content of these messages was unclear, but they seemed to be coordinates, times, and mathematical formulas that suggested preparation for something significant. The economic impact of the Phoenix Lights continued to ripple through Arizona. Property values in areas where the craft had been seen most clearly had increased by 40%, driven by buyers who seemed to have unlimited resources and paid in cash. These buyers were rarely seen after purchase, and the properties they acquired often showed unusual modifications, reinforced foundations, electromagnetic shielding, and underground structures that weren't reflected in any building permits. Local contractors who worked on these properties reported strange requirements: rooms with no apparent purpose, installations of equipment they didn't recognize, and always the insistence on absolute secrecy. In August, a group of witnesses attempted something unprecedented. Using meditation techniques and electromagnetic field generators based on patterns they claimed to have received through their expanded consciousness, they tried to summon the craft. Gathering in the desert under a new moon, they created geometric patterns with powerful lights and transmitted mathematical sequences into space using radio transmitters. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, just as they were preparing to abandon the attempt, a single light appeared overhead, pulsing in response to their transmissions. It descended slowly, stopping just a few hundred feet above them. For 13 minutes it hovered, scanning them with beams of light that felt like gentle pressure against their skin. Then it accelerated vertically and disappeared.
The entire event was captured on multiple cameras, but when the footage was reviewed, the craft appeared differently to each camera, as if it existed in multiple states simultaneously. September 1999 brought revelations that shattered the remaining skepticism about the Phoenix Lights. A team of hackers calling themselves the Digital Prophets infiltrated classified military databases and released thousands of documents before their connections were severed and they disappeared. The documents revealed Operation Mockingbird 2, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to discredit UFO witnesses while simultaneously studying them. The Phoenix Lights witnesses had been unwitting subjects in the largest psychological study ever conducted, their every reaction monitored, their biological changes catalogued, their social connections mapped. But buried deeper in the documents was something more disturbing. The military hadn't just been studying the witnesses, they had been studying the craft itself, because it had returned multiple times to restricted military installations across the Southwest. According to the leaked files, the craft had appeared over the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada, the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and most remarkably had hovered for 3 hours over Area 51 itself. During these appearances, all electronic systems had failed, including hardened military equipment designed to withstand electromagnetic pulses. More troubling, personnel who had been on duty during these incidents reported missing time gaps in their memory that couldn't be accounted for. Some had been found in locations miles from their posts, with no explanation for how they had gotten there. Medical examinations revealed the same biological changes found in Phoenix witnesses: the altered brain chemistry, the unusual neural growth, the modified DNA. Dr. Rebecca Harrison, a geneticist who had been secretly studying the DNA modifications in witnesses, made a discovery that challenged fundamental assumptions about human evolution. The changes weren't random mutations, but appeared to be activated dormant genes, sequences that existed in human DNA,
but had never been expressed in recorded history. These genes, when activated, produced proteins that enhanced cognitive function, increased electromagnetic sensitivity, and most remarkably, seemed to prepare the body for environments with different atmospheric compositions and gravitational fields. It was as if the human genome contained a hidden upgrade package, waiting for the right trigger to activate. Harrison's research suggested that perhaps 10% of Phoenix Light's witnesses were experiencing this activation, and their children were being born with these genes already active. The phenomenon took on a global dimension when researchers discovered that similar genetic activations were occurring in witnesses to UFO encounters worldwide. A database maintained by a consortium of geneticists, working outside official channels, identified over 3,000 individuals showing identical modifications. These people, scattered across every continent, were developing similar abilities and reporting similar experiences. Many described dreams of gathering in vast halls where beings of light provided instruction on subjects ranging from advanced physics to spiritual evolution. Upon waking, they retained fragments of this knowledge, enough to know it was real but not enough to fully reconstruct. In October, an event occurred that forced the government to partially acknowledge what it had been denying for years. During a live television broadcast of a Cardinals football game, with millions watching, a massive triangular craft appeared over the stadium. This time, it wasn't just lights but a clearly visible solid object blocking out the stars, its surface rippling with patterns of energy. It remained visible for 47 minutes, rotating slowly, seemingly unconcerned with the military helicopters that circled it helplessly. The broadcast was cut, but not before millions had seen it. Camera phone footage, still a relatively new phenomenon, spread across the internet faster than it could be suppressed. The official explanation, that it was an experimental military aircraft, satisfied no one. The craft was too large, too advanced, and moved in ways that defied known physics. The aftermath of this public sighting was chaos. Religious groups declared it a sign of the end times. Stock markets fluctuated wildly as investors tried to process the implications. World leaders held emergency sessions, though their deliberations remained secret. But perhaps most significantly, Phoenix Light's witnesses began going public en masse, emboldened by the undeniable proof that they had been telling the truth all along. Press conferences were held, documentation was released, and the suppressed evidence of the past 2.5 years began surfacing. The dam of secrecy was cracking, and the pressure behind it was immense. Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project gained sudden credibility and support. Military and intelligence officials who had remained silent began coming forward with their own experiences. Colonel Robert Dean revealed that NATO had been tracking similar craft since the 1960s. Commander Graham Bethune described encountering a massive circular craft while flying military transport in 1951. These weren't conspiracy theorists, but decorated military officers risking their pensions and reputations to reveal what they knew. Their testimonies painted a picture of contact that had been ongoing for decades, possibly centuries, hidden from the public through a combination of classification, ridicule, and active suppression. The corporate response to these revelations was swift and telling. Major defense contractors' stock prices soared as investors speculated about reverse-engineered alien technology. Patents were filed for propulsion systems and energy sources that seemed to appear from nowhere. Technologies that companies claimed to have been developing in secret for years. The timing was too convenient. The technologies too advanced. It was clear that some corporations had been preparing for this moment, positioning themselves to profit from the gradual disclosure of extraterrestrial contact. Meanwhile, the witnesses continued their transformation. Many reported that they could now sense each other's presence from great distances, a kind of psychic network that connected all those who had been affected by the Phoenix Lights. They began coordinating without conventional communication, showing up at the same locations at the same times, drawn by an impulse they couldn't fully explain. These gatherings often coincided with unusual atmospheric phenomena, aurora-like lights in the desert sky, electromagnetic anomalies that affected compass needles for miles around, and occasionally brief appearances of craft similar to the one seen in March 1997. A group of physicists working independently reached a startling conclusion about the craft's propulsion system. Based on witness descriptions and the few reliable measurements available, they proposed that the craft wasn't traveling through space in the conventional sense but was instead manipulating higher dimensions, essentially taking shortcuts through folded space-time. This would explain its ability to appear and disappear instantly, to move without inertia, and to affect consciousness, as human perception is limited to 3 spatial dimensions. The implications were staggering. If this theory was correct, the visitors weren't just from another planet but potentially from another dimension, another universe, or another time. The year drew to a close with an announcement that shocked even those who had become accustomed to shocking revelation. The President of the United States, in a carefully worded statement, acknowledged that the government had been investigating aerial phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional means. While stopping short of confirming extraterrestrial contact, the statement admitted that there were technologies operating in Earth's atmosphere that weren't of known human origin. A special commission would be formed to study these phenomena and report to the public. The Phoenix Lights were specifically mentioned as an incident requiring further investigation. It was a limited disclosure, but it represented a fundamental shift in official policy. The secret was out, even if the full truth remained hidden. The new millennium began with an event that would have seemed like science fiction just 3 years earlier. On January 1st, 2000, at exactly midnight, every Phoenix Lights witness experienced the same phenomenon simultaneously. Regardless of where they were in the world, they heard a tone not through their ears but directly in their consciousness, a harmonic frequency that resonated through their entire being. With the tone came information, not in words or images but in pure knowledge that integrated instantly into their understanding. They suddenly knew things about the nature of reality that humanity had only theorized about. The universe wasn't just vast, it was infinite in ways that transcended physical space. Consciousness wasn't produced by the brain, it was fundamental to existence itself, with matter being merely its condensed expression. And most importantly, humanity was about to undergo a transition that had been planned since the species began. Dr. Lin Kai-te, who had documented the Phoenix Lights more thoroughly than anyone, found herself at the center of this new development. The knowledge she received during the midnight transmission compelled her to write, and over the course of 3 days, without sleep or rest, she produced a document that would become known as the Phoenix Protocols. It contained mathematical proofs for faster-than-light communication, blueprints for devices that could harness zero-point energy, and most remarkably, instructions for a meditation technique that could activate the dormant genes Dr. Harrison had discovered. When physicists examined the mathematics, they found it was consistent, elegant, and decades ahead of current understanding.
When brave volunteers tried the meditation technique, they reported experiences that ranged from profound spiritual awakening to temporary telepathic abilities. The government's response was predictable but futile. Attempts were made to classify the Phoenix Protocols, to prevent their distribution, but the information had already spread through the network of witnesses who seemed to know instinctively how to share it. Websites appeared and disappeared, documents were passed hand to hand, and within weeks, thousands of people worldwide were experimenting with the techniques. The results were inconsistent but undeniable. Some people experienced nothing, others underwent transformations that medical science couldn't explain. A few disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a faint residue of unknown particles and the smell of ozone. In February, a discovery in the Sonoran Desert added another piece to the puzzle. A team of archaeologists investigating ancient Native American sites discovered a chamber that shouldn't exist. Carved into solid rock, it contained symbols that matched those witnesses had seen on the craft, arranged in patterns that corresponded to star configurations from 30,000 years ago. But the chamber showed signs of recent use. Fresh scorch marks on the walls, electromagnetic readings that suggested massive energy discharges, and most mysteriously, a perfect sphere of polished metal that hovered 3 feet off the ground without any visible support. When the team tried to move it, it remained fixed in space, as if anchored to coordinates rather than to the Earth itself. The sphere became a pilgrimage site for Phoenix Lights witnesses. They reported that proximity to it enhanced their developing abilities, clarified the knowledge they had received, and occasionally triggered visions of other worlds and other times. The military cordoned off the area, but witnesses always found ways to reach it, displaying an uncanny ability to avoid patrols and sensors. Some claimed the sphere was teaching them, downloading information directly into their consciousness. Others said it was a beacon, calling to something that was coming. The archaeologists who discovered it noticed it was gradually increasing in temperature, so slowly that it was barely measurable, but consistently, as if counting down to something. March 13, 2000, the third anniversary of the Phoenix Lights, brought the largest mass sighting in human history. Not just over Phoenix but over major cities worldwide. Triangular craft appeared simultaneously. London, Moscow, Beijing, Tokyo, New York, Paris, Sydney. Every major population center reported the same thing. Massive triangular craft. Silent, majestic, undeniable. They didn't just appear. They performed complex maneuvers that painted geometric patterns in the sky. Light shows that were visible from space. Demonstrations of technology that made human achievement seem primitive. The event lasted exactly 3 hours and 13 minutes. When it ended, when the craft disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, humanity could no longer pretend it was alone. The immediate aftermath was pandemonium. Religions scrambled to incorporate the revelation into their doctrine. Governments that had denied the phenomenon for decades were forced to admit their deception. Scientists who had dismissed UFO research as pseudoscience found themselves desperately trying to understand physics that challenged everything they thought they knew. But among the Phoenix Lights witnesses there was calm. They had known this was coming. The original sighting hadn't been an isolated incident, but the beginning of a process. A gradual introduction to a larger reality that humanity needed time to accept. Dr. Jacques Vallée, who had been studying the phenomenon for decades, proposed that what humanity was experiencing wasn't first contact in the traditional sense but rather a graduation ceremony. The visitors, whatever they were, had been present throughout human history, guiding, observing, occasionally intervening. The Phoenix Lights marked the beginning of a new phase where their presence would be gradually revealed, not because they had just arrived, but because humanity was finally ready to perceive them. The craft themselves might be technological, but their purpose was consciousness expansion, pushing humanity to evolve beyond its current limitations. The economic and social systems that had defined human civilization began to show strain. Why compete for resources when zero-point energy could provide unlimited power? Why wage war when consciousness itself could be expanded to encompass empathy for all beings? Why cling to old beliefs when direct experience of cosmic consciousness was available to anyone willing to undergo the transformation? These questions didn't have easy answers, and the transition was far from smooth. Many resisted, clinging to familiar structures even as they crumbled. Others embraced the change too quickly, abandoning responsibilities and relationships in pursuit of transcendence. A support infrastructure began to emerge, not through government programs or corporate initiatives, but through the grassroots network of those affected by the Phoenix Lights. They called themselves the Phoenix Rising, not as an organization but as a movement, helping others navigate the transformation that was no longer limited to witnesses but was spreading through the population. They established centers where people could safely explore their expanding abilities, where scientists and mystics worked together to understand what was happening, where the frightened could find comfort and the brave could push boundaries. The children of Phoenix Lights witnesses, those born with the activated genes, became the bridge between the old world and the new. They understood technology intuitively but also perceived dimensions of reality that adults struggled to grasp. Some could communicate with the craft directly, serving as translators between human and non-human intelligence. Others demonstrated abilities that seemed like magic but were actually applications of physics humanity hadn't discovered yet. They weren't superior to unaffected humans but different, adapted for a future that was rapidly approaching. As the year 2000 progressed, it became clear that the Phoenix Lights had been more than a sighting. They had been an initiation, the moment when humanity was invited to join a larger community of consciousness that spanned the cosmos. The invitation didn't require leaving Earth or abandoning human identity. Instead, it asked for evolution, for growth, for the courage to become more than what humanity had been. The visitors hadn't come to conquer or save, but to witness and assist as humanity took its next step in a journey that had no end, only endless transformation. By the summer of 2000, the world had fundamentally changed, though most people continued their daily routines as if nothing had happened. The Phoenix Lights witnesses, now numbering in the tens of thousands globally after the March 13th worldwide event, had become living bridges between realities. Among them, a woman named Catherine Webb emerged as an unexpected voice. She had been a pediatric nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospitals on the night of the original sighting, watching from the hospital's roof as the craft passed overhead. What made her unique wasn't just what she saw, but what happened afterward. Every child in the intensive care unit, even those in comas, had simultaneously opened their eyes and spoken the same words in perfect unison. "They're here to help us remember." Catherine had spent 3 years documenting these children's experiences, and what she discovered defied medical explanation. Terminal illnesses went into spontaneous remission. Brain-dead patients showed sudden activity in regions previously thought irreparable. Most remarkably, these children began demonstrating knowledge they couldn't possibly possess, describing surgical procedures they'd never witnessed, speaking languages they'd never heard, solving mathematical problems that would challenge doctorate students. When Catherine finally published her findings in an underground medical journal, she was contacted by doctors worldwide reporting identical phenomena in children who had been in hospitals during UFO sightings. The corporate world's response to the new reality was both predictable and surprising. While traditional industries struggled to maintain relevance, new companies emerged seemingly overnight, founded by Phoenix Lights witnesses who claimed their business models came from the downloaded knowledge. These enterprises didn't operate on conventional capitalist principles. They shared technology freely, refused to patent innovations, and measured success not in profit but in consciousness elevation. Synergy Dynamics, founded by former Microsoft engineer David Chen who had witnessed the lights, developed a computer interface that responded to thought rather than touch. Within months, they were giving away the technology to anyone who wanted it, funded by voluntary contributions from users who had experienced its consciousness-expanding effects. The military-industrial complex found itself in an existential crisis. Weapons designed for terrestrial conflicts were meaningless against visitors who could disable electronics with thought and phase through solid matter. General Patricia Hayes, who had been in charge of the Air Force's response to the Phoenix Lights, shocked her colleagues by resigning her commission and revealing that the military had known about the visitors for decades but had been powerless to stop them. More importantly, she explained, the visitors had never shown hostility, only curiosity and what could best be described as parental concern. The craft that had been interpreted as threats were actually preventing nuclear wars, disabling weapons systems moments before they would have been used, intervening just enough to keep humanity from destroying itself. In August, something extraordinary happened at the Sphere in the Sonoran Desert. A 12-year-old girl named Maria Gonzalez, daughter of a Phoenix Lights witness, approached the sphere and placed her hand on it. Instead of the usual visions or downloads, she disappeared, her body becoming translucent before vanishing entirely. Her terrified parents and the military personnel guarding the site watched in horror, but before panic could set in, she reappeared 3 hours later. Though she claimed only minutes had passed, she brought with her a message, delivered not in words but in direct consciousness transmission to everyone present. The sphere was a doorway, not through space, but through dimensions of consciousness. Humanity was being offered the chance to explore not other worlds but other ways of being. The message Maria delivered contained specific instructions. On December 21st, at locations around the world that formed a geometric pattern encompassing the entire planet, doorways would open. Not everyone would be able to perceive them, and fewer still would be able to pass through, but those who could would serve as ambassadors to realities beyond current human comprehension. The transformation that had begun with the Phoenix Lights was accelerating, and humanity was approaching what the visitors called the choice point, a moment when the species would collectively decide its evolutionary path. Religious institutions struggled to incorporate these revelations into their doctrines. The Vatican held emergency councils,
debating whether the visitors were angels, demons, or something entirely outside their theological framework. Some denominations embraced the phenomena as divine revelation, while others condemned it as satanic deception. But among the witnesses, traditional religious boundaries began to dissolve. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and atheists found themselves sharing identical spiritual experiences that transcended their previous beliefs. They weren't converting to a new religion, but discovering a spirituality that preceded and encompassed all religions. Dr. Richard Coleman, a quantum physicist at MIT, who had initially dismissed the Phoenix Lights, became one of the phenomenon's most important researchers after experiencing his own encounter. Using equipment designed to detect quantum fluctuations, he discovered that reality itself was becoming more fluid around Phoenix Lights. Witnesses, the laws of physics weren't being broken, but revealed to be more flexible than previously thought. Consciousness, he theorized, wasn't separate from physical reality but was actively participating in its creation. The witnesses weren't just observing different phenomena, they were literally existing in a slightly different version of reality, one where the impossible became possible.
This revelation had practical implications.
Witnesses began demonstrating abilities that shouldn't exist according to conventional science: telekinesis, remote viewing, spontaneous healing. These weren't party tricks but applications of consciousness-reality interaction that the visitors had been trying to teach humanity. The Phoenix Lights hadn't just been a sighting, they had been an activation, triggering dormant potentials in human consciousness that had always existed but required a catalyst to manifest. The craft themselves might have been technological, but their primary function was consciousness expansion, serving as amplifiers for human potential. The summer of 2000 also saw the emergence of what witnesses called the network, not an internet-based system but a consciousness-based communication method that connected all those affected by the Phoenix Lights. They could share thoughts, emotions, and experiences instantaneously across any distance. The network wasn't always active, requiring conscious intention to access, but when engaged, it provided a form of communication that made language obsolete. Complex concepts could be shared in moments, entire lifetimes of experience transmitted in seconds. It was, witnesses claimed, how the visitors communicated among themselves, and humanity was being taught to join the conversation. As autumn approached, the signs of coming change multiplied. Aurora-like phenomena appeared in the skies over Phoenix nightly, visible only to witnesses and those they were teaching. Animals began behaving strangely, with mass migrations that didn't follow seasonal patterns, as if they were responding to signals humans couldn't perceive. Even the Earth itself seemed to be participating, with unprecedented geological activity at specific locations that corresponded to the geometric pattern Maria had described. Something was building, a crescendo that would peak on December 21st, and those sensitive to it could feel it in their bones, a vibration that grew stronger each day. October 2000 brought revelations that challenged even those who had accepted the reality of extraterrestrial contact. Dr. Lin Kai-te received a visit, not from government agents or mysterious men in black, but from three beings who appeared human yet radiated an energy that made it clear they were something else. They materialized in her living room without using the door, their bodies seeming to coalesce from light itself. They communicated without speaking, their thoughts flowing directly into her consciousness with a clarity that made misunderstanding impossible.
They revealed that they had been walking among humanity for millennia, indistinguishable from humans, except to those whose consciousness had been expanded. The Phoenix Lights had been their way of preparing humanity for this revelation, creating a subset of the population capable of perceiving them as they truly were. These beings, who called themselves the Shepherds, explained that humanity was not the first intelligence to evolve on Earth. Civilizations had risen and fallen in cycles spanning millions of years, each reaching a point where they either transcended physical existence or destroyed themselves. Humanity was approaching this crucial juncture, and the Shepherds were here to guide the transition, not to impose an outcome but to ensure humanity had the knowledge necessary to make an informed choice. They showed Kai-te visions of previous civilizations, their magnificent achievements and tragic ends, the remnants of their existence hidden beneath oceans and ice, deliberately concealed to allow humanity to develop without the burden of knowing it wasn't the first.
The shepherds revealed that the craft seen over Phoenix and subsequently around the world were not vehicles in the traditional sense but manifestations of consciousness given form. They were tools for expanding perception, allowing humans to glimpse realities beyond the narrow spectrum their senses normally perceived. Every witness to the Phoenix Lights had been genetically and consciously prepared over generations for this moment. Their family lines had been subtly guided, their DNA modified through seemingly natural processes, all leading to March 13, 1997, when the activation would begin. This information spread through the network instantaneously, reaching every connected witness simultaneously. The reaction was not fear but recognition, as if they were remembering something they had always known but forgotten. Many reported that their entire life suddenly made sense, that seemingly random events and coincidences had been preparation for this role. They weren't chosen ones in the sense of being superior, but were selected based on their genetic and consciousness potential to serve as bridges between humanity and the greater cosmic community. Meanwhile, at Luke Air Force Base, Colonel James Richardson faced an impossible situation. The base had been experiencing intrusions that defied every security measure. Beings matching the description of the shepherds would appear in classified areas, examine equipment and disappear before security could respond. They never took anything or caused damage, but their presence demonstrated that human military power was irrelevant against their capabilities. Richardson's superiors demanded action, but what could be done against beings who could phase through walls and disable weapons with thought? His report, classified beyond even presidential access, concluded that humanity's only option was cooperation. The children continued to be the most dramatically affected. Sarah Chen, now 13, had begun leading meditation sessions where participants reported leaving their bodies and traveling to what she called the teaching halls. These were vast spaces that existed outside normal spacetime where beings from countless civilizations gathered to share knowledge. The halls contained information about technologies that could solve every problem humanity faced, from energy to disease to death itself. But the knowledge came with understanding of the responsibility it entailed. Technology without wisdom had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than Earth's. The children were being taught not just how to build miraculous devices but when and why to use them. A breakthrough came when Marcus Williams, the former police officer who had experienced missing time, suddenly remembered what had happened during those lost hours. He had been taken not aboard a craft but into a state of expanded consciousness where time moved differently. He had lived entire lifetimes in other realities, experiencing existence as beings of pure energy, as collective consciousnesses spanning galaxies, as entities for whom physical reality was just one of many simultaneous experiences. The memories were overwhelming, but they came with abilities. Marcus found he could perceive probability streams, seeing potential futures spreading out from each present moment. He couldn't predict the future with certainty, but he could see the likely outcomes of decisions, a gift and burden that made normal life impossible. The economic system began showing signs of fundamental transformation. Money started losing meaning among witnesses who could manifest what they needed through consciousness-reality interaction. Small communities formed where traditional economics were replaced by resource sharing, based on need rather than trade. These weren't communes in the traditional sense, but laboratories for new forms of social organization that would be necessary in a post-disclosure world. The old systems didn't collapse overnight, but began to seem increasingly primitive, like using candles when electric lights were available. November brought the announcement everyone had been expecting and dreading. The president, in a globally televised address, confirmed what millions already knew. Humanity was not alone. Contact had been established with non-human intelligences. The Phoenix Lights had been the beginning of an open interaction that would culminate on December 21st. On that date, at specific locations worldwide, opportunities would be presented for humanity to join what the president carefully called a broader community of consciousness. Participation would be voluntary, but the opportunity might not come again. The speech was carefully crafted, providing confirmation without causing panic, but the underlying message was clear that reality as humanity had known it was ending. The reaction was surprisingly muted. Those who had been following the Phoenix Lights story were vindicated but not surprised. Skeptics found themselves confronted with undeniable evidence, but often chose denial over acceptance. Most people continued their daily routines, unable or unwilling to process the implications. But beneath the surface calm, everything was changing. Children stopped attending schools that seemed to teach irrelevant information. Workers left jobs that no longer made sense in a reality where scarcity was ending. Relationships reformed around shared consciousness, rather than physical proximity. As December approached, the energy became palpable. Phoenix itself had become a pilgrimage site, with thousands arriving daily, drawn by intuition more than information. The sky above the city displayed nightly phenomena that news networks had stopped trying to explain. Craft appeared so frequently that they became unremarkable. The boundary between normal and paranormal had dissolved. Reality had become fluid, responsive to consciousness in ways that made the old laws of physics seem like suggestions rather than rules. December 21st was no longer just a date, but a threshold. Those sensitive to the approaching transition reported the same sensation, like standing at the edge of an ocean, feeling the pull of tides from a sea vaster than Earth's oceans combined. The Phoenix Lights had been the first wave lapping at humanity's shores. Now the tsunami of change was visible on the horizon, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Some prepared to embrace it, others to resist, but all understood that after December 21st, nothing would ever be the same. December 21st arrived within sunrise unlike any in recorded history. The sky over Phoenix turned colors that didn't have names, shifting through spectrums beyond human visual perception, but somehow still visible to those who had been affected by the lights. At exactly 6:13 a.m., the moment of winter solstice, the transformation began, not with the dramatic appearances many expected, but with a subtle shift in the fabric of reality itself. Witnesses worldwide reported the same sensation, as if the universe had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for humanity to decide what came next. The doorways Maria Gonzalez had described began to manifest, not as physical portals, but as areas where the boundaries between dimensions became permeable. In Phoenix, the primary doorway appeared at South Mountain, exactly where the craft had hovered 3.5 years earlier. It wasn't visible to everyone. Those who couldn't perceive it walked through the space unaffected, continuing their morning hikes as if nothing was happening. But for those with expanded consciousness, it was unmistakable, a shimmering region where reality folded in on itself, revealing infinite layers of existence occupying the same space. Catherine Webb was among the first to approach the Phoenix doorways. As she stepped into the threshold, her body seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, solid and translucent, present and absent, human and something more. She later described the experience as being everywhere and nowhere at once, experiencing every moment of her existence simultaneously, while also perceiving the experiences of countless other beings. She saw the truth of the Phoenix Lights, not just as a single event, but as one note in a symphony that had been playing since consciousness first emerged in the universe. The craft hadn't come to Earth. Earth had finally evolved enough to perceive what had always been there. Around the world, similar scenes played out at the designated locations. In Egypt, a doorway opened at the Great Pyramid. In Peru, at Machu Picchu. In England, at Stonehenge. Each location had been chosen for its significance as an ancient contact point, places where previous civilizations had communed with the greater consciousness. Thousands approached these doorways, some passing through easily, others finding themselves unable to cross the threshold despite desperate attempts. It wasn't about worthiness or preparation but about resonance. Those whose consciousness vibrated at the necessary frequency could enter. Others would need more time to develop. The beings who had orchestrated the Phoenix Lights finally revealed themselves fully. They weren't extraterrestrials in the conventional sense, but representatives of consciousness itself, having evolved beyond the need for permanent physical form. Billions of years ago, they existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, experiencing reality in ways that human language couldn't describe. The craft seen over Phoenix had been their attempt to compress their multidimensional nature into something humans could perceive, like casting a three-dimensional shadow of a hyperdimensional object. They had been patient, waiting eons for humanity to develop the capacity to comprehend their existence. Dr. Lin Kai-te, who had documented everything from the beginning, made a choice that surprised no one who knew her. She entered the doorway carrying all her research, determined to understand the phenomenon from the other side. What she found exceeded her wildest theories. The universe wasn't just vast, it was infinite in dimensions humans hadn't yet discovered. Consciousness wasn't produced by matter, but was the fundamental force from which matter emerged. Every atom, every particle, every quantum fluctuation was consciousness expressing itself in physical form. The Phoenix Lights had been consciousness recognizing itself, the universe becoming aware of its own awareness through human observation. The transformation wasn't limited to those who entered the doorway. Everyone touched by the Phoenix Lights found themselves changing in ways that defied medical
Though the change had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like watching a photograph develop in slow motion. Now, in 2002, the transformation was undeniable. Phoenix had become the unofficial capital of the New World, not through political designation, but through consciousness concentration. The city pulsed with an energy that could be felt from space, a beacon for those undergoing the transformation that had begun with lights in the desert sky. Dr. Lin Kai-te stood on the observation deck of what had once been South Mountain, now transformed into something beyond human architecture. The structure existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its form shifting depending on the consciousness of the observer. To those still limited to three-dimensional perception, it appeared as a simple building. To those with expanded awareness, it was a crystalline palace of light, extending into dimensions that didn't have names. She had spent 2 years traveling between realities, learning from beings whose existence spanned galaxies, and had returned with knowledge that was slowly being integrated into human understanding. The Phoenix Lights, she now knew with absolute certainty, had been planned since humanity's first conscious thought, a moment predetermined in the fabric of space-time itself. The children who had witnessed the lights had grown into something beyond traditional human classification. Sarah Chen, now 18, served as an ambassador between humanity and the collective consciousness that surrounded Earth like an invisible ocean. She could exist in multiple locations simultaneously, her consciousness spread across dimensions, while maintaining coherent identity. When she spoke, which was rare now that direct consciousness transmission had become the preferred communication method, her words carried harmonics that resonated in listeners' DNA, activating dormant potentials with simple phrases. She and others like her were not the future of humanity but its present, living examples of what humans had always been capable of becoming. The economic system had completely transformed, though not through revolution or collapse, but through obsolescence. When consciousness could manifest matter, when energy could be drawn from quantum fluctuations, when distance became meaningless through dimensional doorways, the entire concept of economy became antiquated. Resources flowed where needed, guided not by markets or governments but by collective consciousness responding to genuine need. The transition hadn't been without difficulty. Many clung to old systems, unable or unwilling to accept that scarcity had been an illusion maintained by limited perception. But gradually, as more people experienced the abundance that came with consciousness expansion, resistance faded. The beings who had shown themselves as the shepherds revealed their true nature. They were humanity's future selves, travelers from a timeline where consciousness evolution had proceeded without interference. The Phoenix Lights had been their intervention, a carefully calculated alteration to the timeline designed to prevent humanity from following the path that led to near extinction in their original history. By appearing in 1997, at that specific moment, in that specific way, they had created a ripple that changed everything. Every witness had become a node in a new timeline, anchoring a reality where humanity successfully navigated the transition from physical to consciousness-based existence. The military advance to the new reality had been unexpected. Instead of fighting the transformation, many within the defense establishment embraced it. General Patricia Hayes, who had initially investigated the Phoenix Lights, now led what she called the Consciousness Defense Initiative, not defending against consciousness,
but using consciousness as humanity's primary defense against the challenges that came with joining the galactic community. Because Earth was not entering a peaceful utopia but a complex ecosystem of consciousness, where not all beings had benevolent intentions, the Phoenix Lights witnesses, with their expanded awareness, became Earth's early warning system, able to detect consciousness intrusions from hostile entities that existed in dimensions beyond physical space. Religion had undergone the most radical transformation, the appearance of beings that existed across dimensions, the direct experience of consciousness beyond death, the revelation that what humans called God was the collective consciousness of all existence experiencing itself, subjective. These truths had shattered and rebuilt spiritual understanding. Churches, temples, and mosques became consciousness expansion centers, where traditional prayers were replaced by group meditations that connected participants directly to the source consciousness. The Phoenix Lights were recognized as a modern religious event equivalent to any described in sacred text, perhaps the most significant spiritual occurrence in human history. Tim Lay, the former Air Force communications specialist who had witnessed the craft with his family, had become something unprecedented in human history. The sensation of calm he had experienced as the craft passed overhead had been the beginning of a transformation that culminated in his ability to serve as a living communication node between Earth and civilizations throughout the galaxy. His consciousness could stretch across light years instantaneously, facilitating conversations between species that had never before been able to communicate. Through him and others like him, humanity was learning that the universe was not silent, but had been broadcasting continuously on frequencies human consciousness couldn't previously perceive. The technology that emerged from the Phoenix Lights revelations defied conventional understanding. Devices that operated on consciousness rather than electricity, healing chambers that repaired bodies by restoring their quantum template, transportation systems that moved people through folded space rather than across it. But the most significant development was the understanding that technology and consciousness were not separate. Every tool was an extension of consciousness, every machine a crystallization of thought. The craft seen over Phoenix hadn't been built in factories but grown through focused intention, consciousness, taking form to serve specific purposes. As 2002 progressed, it became clear that the Phoenix Lights had initiated a divergence in human evolution. Not everyone was transforming at the same rate. Some, perhaps 30% of the population, showed rapid consciousness expansion, developing abilities that would have been considered superhuman just years earlier. Others progressed more slowly, needing years or decades to achieve what some accomplished in days, and a portion of humanity seemed unable or unwilling to change at all, maintaining the old consciousness patterns despite living in a fundamentally transformed world. There was no judgment in these differences, only recognition that consciousness evolution, like physical evolution, proceeded through diversity rather than uniformity. The Phoenix Lights witnesses had become living libraries, their consciousness containing not just memories of the event, but downloaded knowledge from civilizations across the cosmos. When they slept, they traveled to teaching dimensions where beings of pure thought shared wisdom accumulated over billions of years. When they woke, they brought back fragments of this knowledge, slowly assembling a new understanding of reality that would guide humanity's next phase of evolution. They were no longer just witnesses but participants in a cosmic drama that had been unfolding since the first spark of consciousness emerged from quantum foam. Looking back at March 13, 1997, from the perspective of 2002, the journey seemed both eternal and instantaneous. The lights over Phoenix had been a doorway, not just to extraterrestrial contact, but to humanity's true identity as consciousness temporarily experiencing itself in physical form. Every witness had known, in that moment of observation, that reality was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. And now, 5 years later, as humanity stood on the threshold of becoming something unimaginable, the Phoenix Lights continued to burn in collective memory, not as lights in the sky, but as the moment when humanity began to remember what it had always been. The cover-up had failed not because evidence had emerged or officials had confessed, but because reality itself had changed to the point where cover-ups became meaningless. How could you hide something that was everywhere, that was everything, that was the very fabric of existence revealing itself? The 10,000 witnesses had become 10 million, then 100 million, as consciousness expansion spread like a beneficial virus through human society. The Phoenix Lights had been the match that lit a fire that would eventually consume every illusion, Every limitation, every false belief that had kept humanity trapped in a narrow band of perception. As the sun set over Phoenix on another clear desert evening, the sky began to pulse with the familiar lights that had started it all. But now they were understood not as alien craft, but as consciousness itself becoming visible, the universe winking at its newest aware participants. The witnesses gathered as they did every evening, not to watch but to participate, adding their consciousness to the grand symphony that played between the stars.
The Phoenix lights had never really ended. They had simply become so common, so integrated into human experience, that they no longer seemed extraordinary. And that, perhaps, was the greatest transformation of all, that the impossible had become ordinary, that the extraordinary had become expected, that humanity had finally come home to its true nature. The journey that began with lights in the Phoenix sky would continue for generations, perhaps forever, as humanity explored the infinite dimensions of consciousness that the lights had revealed. But the most important step had been taken. The door had been opened. The invitation had been accepted. And somewhere in dimensions beyond human perception, beings that had waited eons for this moment celebrated the success of their patient intervention. The Phoenix lights had done their job. Humanity was awake. The real adventure was just beginning.